On to the news we go. We're going to start off. I did write a story today about the passing of Sika Anoa'i. With due respect to our Samoan listenership, I'm not going to attempt his legal name because this one is. I sometimes challenge myself on some of the names. This one is a little above me.
Give it a shot. Come on.
Oh man, don't want to do the man's memory.
Well,
ill
you
here.
know most of how
I
it's
would go
pronounced.
Liati Sika Emma Tuawani and Oahi. How's that?
Okay, I mean that's
Someone is shaking
sounds
their
all right.
head in disgust at what I just tried, but he went by Sika.
Yeah, it sounds like a good attempt, and
I mean, he was given this name. We should be honoring his full name. But yes, it was his nephew that provided the news on Tuesday that Sika, who is the father of had 5 children, most famously Roman Reigns, Joe Anoa'i, and the late Matt Anoa'i, who performed as Rosie. And this image of this picture, when they were inducted into the Hall of Fame, they would bring them. They always bring them out for the acknowledgement at WrestleMania the next night. And when the camera's going across, and then I think it was Finkel who's introducing them. It's like the wild Samoans, and boom, they just transform back to like 1975, and they've got the exaggerated facial expressions. And I loved it. It was such a great talk about guys who like you're gonna have 15 seconds on camera and maximized it. It was this image. So that's mainly why I went with this picture. But he was obviously part of an enormous family that got involved in professional wrestling, and he was one of 13 children, including Afa, who was several years older than him. And the family moved to San Francisco when he was in his teenage years. And then it was, he went off to the Merchant Marines. And when he came back, Afa had already been training to get into professional wrestling. So Sika joined in as well. And together, the two went to their first territory was Stampede Wrestling, and they won titles there. These two won tag titles in so many different territories. But Canada was where they kind of first cut their teeth. It was in Calgary, and then going to Vancouver as well before venturing into the US. And again, they won belts in Detroit for big time wrestling. They worked Tennessee. They worked WWC in Puerto Rico, Alabama. Their first tour of Japan was with IWE, and then later they also toured with New Japan Pro Wrestling, one of the first tag league tournaments they were involved in the second year that they did the tag league. But their big runs came in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, where Sika had multiple stints beginning in 1980. And through the first run, of course, especially in that territory, but wherever the Wild Samoans went, these guys were not doing their promos. So they always would have a mouthpiece. And in New York, they had Captain Lou Albano for that first run. They worked Madison Square Garden very early on, and Sika even got a main event at a garden show in March of 1980. Bob Backlund was the champion, and it was a rare kind of high-profile singles match for Sika. And the business for the show, they did really well. Like, they sold out the garden. This is Backlund at his peak, but they filled the garden. He never didn't do a whole lot of singles matches, but that was kind of a feather in his cap. And they ended up winning their first set of tag titles in the WWF and losing them at the Shea Stadium show that year in 1980, but then won them right back because they lost the belts to Backlund and Pedro Morales, and Backlund was the champion at the time, so he couldn't hold 2 titles, so he had to vacate them back when that was the thing in the WWF. That was like the Ultimate Warrior rule after WrestleMania. It's like, you can't have 2 belts. What do you think this is?
they did just unify them and create a new championship, I guess.
No, they did not. He had to vacate them, and they put them up in a tournament, and the Wild Samoans got the tag titles back. So that was quite the journey. They go to New Japan in 1981, and they are rebranded way. They spent a long time coming up with like what names are going to resonate with the audience in Japan with these two, and they went from Afa Sika, and they were renamed Samoan number 1 and Samoan number 2.
Right. Yeah.
That sounds like a we've booked them, and here we have bestowed upon you. You never want to have number anything attached to your ring name. That's a tough one.
They're basically like the machines at that point.
in a certain point, yes. But they were part of that one and only tag league they worked in '81, which featured a lot of high profile teams at the time. Then they went to Mid South, where Ernie Ladd was their manager at first, and then they turned on him to join with Skandor Akbar. They won tag titles there. In Georgia Championship Wrestling, they win the belts there. And this is an interesting story because they leave the territory to go back to New York and they never drop the titles. So the Georgia tag titles are dormant for several months. And this is when Ole Anderson, they had been booking Joe Laurinaitis as like this underneath guy. And Ole is in contact with Eddie Sharkey, and that's when he spots Michael Hegstrand and decides to put these two together and create the Road Warriors. And they just show up on TV. They're the new tag champions. They've won this fictional tournament, and that's the creation of the Road Warriors. So it's like obviously a very indirect role in it, but for the time period, the Road Warriors became like the hot act for all these other teams to copy and became a major tag team in the 80s and into the 90s. And it kind of was precipitated by, the Wild Samoans left, and they came up with this this measure to correct the tag title situation. So they go back to the WWF, and they have another run with the tag belts. And then we're into the expansion era with Vince McMahon. And during this period, Hogan wins the title, and one of his very first challenges is against Sika in Buffalo, of all places, in April of 1984. So he got another singles match for the title. And then after 1984, they would bounce around. They did some matches in AWA, Jim Crockett Promotions. And then in 86, Sika comes in for a singles run in WWF, and he's well down the card. He's working as an undercard heel, and he's got the Wizard, Curtis Iakea, as his manager, which is one of the all-time legendary characters, Curtis Iakea, and briefly teamed with Kamala, but then goes back to working singles, and he's pretty much an underneath guy, with the big point of this run being another match with Hogan that was the big title match on an October 87 edition of Saturday Night's Main Event, where he challenged Hogan. They did like a 10-minute match, and it did like a 9.7 rating on NBC. So, I mean, it was very, very few like title matches he had, but he had like a pretty good track record when it came to the business he drew for the very few times he was used. I would not argue it was, he was obviously not the A side in these matches with Backlund or Hogan, but carried his end of the deal in terms of respectable numbers on network television or at Madison Square Garden. And then his last match in the company is WrestleMania 4 in that battle royal that Brett and Bad News Allen get into the, they think that they're the co-winners, and then Bad News turns on Brett. And after wrestling, he's pretty much done by the early 90s. He was heavily involved with the training center that the Wild Samoans ran, which their school they opened up. I didn't realize this. They opened it up in like the late 70s, and lots of their family members came through the school, like Yokozuna, Rikishi, Rosie and Jamal. Batista went through there. A lot of guys got like their start or seasoning at the Wild Samoans training camp, which always was a bit of a pipeline to the WWF, especially in the 90s. And then was honored by the Cauliflower Alley Club, went into the WWE Hall of Fame, the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, and I would say to a generation now that like his link is as the father of like the big star of the era in Roman Reigns, and he's had some cameo appearances throughout this whole Roman Reigns run and the inclusion of the Bloodline. And I'm just, because of the timing of it all, I'm curious if there's any sort of subtle reference or just direct to when they're doing this Bloodline acknowledgement ceremony on Friday at Madison Square Garden, which has its history. And if they opt to do something in honor of Sika that's worked into the segment itself, it'll be something interesting to watch. But, a pretty prolific tag wrestler. Everyone is familiar with the Wild Samoans that were, just kind of a staple of like many different territories, but in particular in the WWF.
I have to think that they would do something, tasteful and something to honor, Sika. Just given, I think how much of a big deal I think they still consider the Wild Samoans in the history of the WWF, and just simply as like, at least on the Anoa'i side, the first link of that family to the WWF, I think is incredibly significant. So I have to think that they would mention it and maybe make a somewhat bigger deal out of it than,
I think they'll go beyond just like the match graphic or something, or like it's there to do something that like to honor him, and it's within the story as well of the bloodline. Like there's certainly an opportunity there.